All right, welcome back to On the Ball, the podcast series from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and I am really excited to have my good friend Celso Castillo here with us as our guest today. Celso is an associate professor of history here at Vanderbilt and also the director of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies. He's a huge soccer fan, both just as a fan, but also as a historian and scholar of the game of soccer. So last time I saw you, you were presenting on some of the research you've done on the 1994 World Cup. And I know you had been there as a young fan yourself, but then also really studying just sort of the Latino fan culture and the media coverage and what was happening in politics in California and Los Angeles at that time. So you're the ideal guest to have now to discuss some of the intersections of soccer and politics and current events happening in the United States here as the Club World Cup is taking place. So, Celso, thank you so much for joining the show.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's a great pleasure and everything you do with the Sports and Society Initiative at Vanderbilt and for making space for this conversation. I mean, this is an important register of the moment, and I think it'll give us something to look back to and to think more about, especially with the Men's World Cup around the corner next year, with the LA Olympics in 28, with the Women's World Cup in 2031. So, yeah, no, thank you so much for creating this opportunity.
Absolutely. So I see you've got your Angel City t-shirt on. You're not really hiding your soccer fandom. I think you're headed on a trip with your kids tomorrow to Philadelphia. Like, what's going through your mind at this point, just as a soccer fan with what's happening in the country right now? And for those who aren't informed, what is the Club World Cup versus the World Cup that we're familiar with?
Yeah, no, thank you, Andrew. There's just so much kind of going through, my head sort of simultaneously, both on a personal front. So I grew up in LA. I was born in Brazil, raised in a Brazilian Peruvian family, in a part of LA that is now talked about as Southeastern LA. Uh, Overwhelmingly Latino immigrant communities in the 80s and 90s. And as you mentioned, so now I'm also doing a book about the 94 World Cup and studying how the politics of immigration back then intersected with the World Cup itself. Um, and certainly, residing in Nashville now since 2008, and having been affected like a lot of us here in Nashville with the ice raids earlier in May, and then seeing more recently over the last 10 days or so the devastating images and impacts, and knowing very well firsthand from a lot of people of how it's kind of gone down in LA. I mean, and I'm talking about, areas of LA that are one freeway exit over from where I grew up. So I mean, it's very, very personal, and it hit home in a very visceral way. And out of those stories, it was really impressive and inspiring to see Angel City in particular, take an immediate stand. And I keep thinking about this and just kind of more on the business side of things, like the pace at which this had to have happened, right? Because what we know is that, as things were getting worse and worse over the middle of last week, by Saturday, when folks walked into the game to the stadium, they had T-shirts that said, this is Immigrant City. We, Los Angeles for everybody, Los Angeles para todos. And so, so it was, and I did, and these are for sale. So I did order mine. Unfortunately, it didn't come in to be able to wear it today. But this is a way to, pay homage to that and to respect that stance that was taken. Um, yeah, and so you were asking also about the Club World Cup. Um, the Club World Cup is a lot of things. It's a lot of things all bound up into one, and it kind of you're gonna get as many different answers to as many different people you ask, right? Um, in a nutshell, though, this is a new iteration of a very old competition, dating back to the mid 20th century to the 1960s. The European Soccer Federation and the South American Soccer Federation had engaged in this kind of home and home, exhibition, but there was a lot of pride at stake, and especially so from the Latin American teams, right? And so this was kind of known as the Intercontinental Cup, and the lore, the attachment, the significance of being able to play the European champion, and to host one of those games in your local, it meant everything. I mean, the pride of winning one of these games those stars are still on jerseys. And so Pelé's team, for example, won in the early 60s, it won back-to-back, Santos did, and so forth and so on. Into the 1980s, they consolidated that home and home match, and they would play one match in Tokyo, Japan, from 1980 to 2000, right? And it was still the European champion against the Latin American champion. And admittedly, I think also taking into account larger geopolitics, taking into account financials, this game meant a lot more to the Latin American teams, right? I mean, this was a way to sort of show yourself that you were as good, that you had to play to actually have a what we'd call a world champion, right? That is sometimes just kind of a tacked on to U.S. sporting competitions.
Right.
Um, and with the popularity of this, FIFA now as the overarching entity of international soccer decided to, probably animated for just business purposes to organize their own version of this, right? And the problem that they kind of kept bumping into was that the European Federation in particular wanted nothing to do with that, right? I mean, and they will give reasons about overtaxing the players, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, there was a fair amount of autonomy that they were also interested in preserving. And at the end of the day, from a sporting perspective, right? Um, if your team gets, it was more prestigious for the European team to be known as the de facto world champion than to have to play a competition
Right.
against other teams from other parts of the world, right? And so that kind of in fits and starts over the last, 10, 15 years, it's kind of gone in different directions. And finally, with the World Cup coming, the Men's World Cup coming here in 2026, FIFA launched this massive, massive project to organize this 32 team World Cup. And, they came up with a, fairly elaborate but decently representative structure of recent champions from the different regional federations that were invited to participate in this, in what is now an inaugural 32 team event. There's still a lot of complaints, particularly from the European federations about, again, you're taxing on games at a time where in their calendar it's their preseason and their rest season, right? And so they kind of keep throwing that out insofar as, well, we've, and it's interesting that now that they're actually playing and we see the stats on how many games the respective teams that are participating in this tournament have played over the last 12 months, right? It's the Brazilian teams, the top Brazilian team has played 78 games. The top team in the Premier League has played 48 games, right? So like that's
Yeah.
that's a whole season in and of itself if you kind of take
Yeah.
that into account, right? So like there's all these interesting dynamics about like it's power, it's money. I mean, FIFA's, the amount of money that has been thrown at this tournament, and it's different kind of challenges to kind of take off. But finally, it's here and it's taken root, and yeah, I mean, it's intersected, of course, with national politics, and
Mm.
yeah, I don't know where we would
Yeah.
want to go with that.
Sure. No, I was going to ask you, in what ways have we already seen it, or are we anticipating that it will intersect? I mean, you've got the world fans from all over the world presumably coming for these games to the United States at a time where, at least in my lifetime, it's never felt more hostile to visitors or to immigrants in this country. Um, I think I've seen some articles saying that ICE is planning to be there at the venues. What have you read or learned about the way that present day American politics will already have or will intersect with this tournament?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think it's a great kind of angle to situate this competition. And to approach it because one of the reasons the US and Mexico and Canada got the bid for 2026, 8 years ago, and Trump was very enthusiastic about that. This was during his first administration, right? And the kind of global showcase that it was going to bring, and having been reelected more recently, then he was particularly elated to be able to host, and so he's developed a close, at least on a business kind of public image perspective, a close relationship with the head of FIFA, of Infantino. Um, and it's been, FIFA on the one hand has, also poured a lot of money. And granted, we wish it was perhaps a little bit more substantive efforts and initiatives, but it's still there nonetheless. And it was there because of the efforts of NGOs around the world, but in Europe in particular, to kind of, spotlight questions about human rights and racism and sexism and gender discrimination. Um, and so what now has happened though is you have, FIFA, wanting to host this tournament and wanting to bring its, some of its quote values to the US at a time where, as we know, in the Super Bowl, for example, they didn't have the anti-racism messages that we have seen in recent years. And now, there was, I think, what generated a lot of controversy. Customs and Border Patrol put out a tweet late last week saying that they were booted and suited for ICE operations during the World Cup, and it's not in the abstract. That is as we are seeing images every 30 seconds of these ice rays, right? Of these horrific. Uh, we've all seen them, right? And so like so to kind of latch that onto the stadium, and we have seen also the effects. And here in Nashville, we were both, we both lived it as we saw when the ice raids were happening in the most intense moment in early May. It did dissuade Latino fan groups from coming to the games, and certainly as the organized Latino fan groups from participating in the matches, as has been the case for the last 4 years. So, and so there was a lot of pushback once that tweet was put out by the government, and it's underlings in FIFA trying to do the backdoor politics, and the government kind of staying put. As of right now, I mean, we're talking on Wednesday, June 18th. I am not aware of any ICE raids that have happened at the sites per se, but we all know that it's on the way home, it's in the perimeters, it's where these actions have happened that are also very much in play. And I do think though that like um, it just sends a message, right? And then I think that's very kind of powerful in terms of trying the question of attendance that has already been on the table to discuss as to whether it was the right move to host them in these football-sized stadiums as opposed to the more soccer-specific stadiums that are across the country. So a crowd of 21,000 for a particular match looks okay if it's a 25,000 person venue,
Mhm.
as opposed to hosting it at at one of these football venues. And we've seen these attendance concerns. I just got an email 10 minutes ago from Nashville SC saying that for the game on Friday in Nashville, it's half off for an adult ticket, and you get two children's tickets under age of 16 for free, right? I mean,
Wow.
like there is a real concern, and historically, groups that have gone to the stadium and have filled the stadium, are immigrants in general, but Latino fans in particular, that has been a bread and butter of U.S. soccer. So these are some of the issues that are kind of percolating as this tournament is unfolding, and certainly, as you mentioned, the question of tourist visa, right, and who can come, and we have already seen, massive contingents of fans from Brazil and Argentina in particular, but also Morocco and Tunisia, and it's hard to kind of parse out sometimes the extent to which it's overseas travel, international travel, and also U.S. based populations. But
Hmm. You mentioned the raids here in Nashville. There was Latino fan groups that were holding up banners at the Nashville SC game, essentially saying, not all of us are here. There are fan groups in Los Angeles that have used their platform as well. For those who haven't been following that story, like what have we seen from Latino fans in places like Nashville, Los Angeles, maybe elsewhere, and using soccer venues as a place to share a voice, to share opinion, and those connections between the raids that are happening in neighborhoods and what is being said, at soccer games and in venues.
yeah, no, that's a great point, and that's a very important kind of critical question. When you think about Latino politics and cultural politics in particular, the soccer venues, both in this specific moment, but also more broadly, right? If you think about it in terms of Latin American popular culture and Latin American sports, soccer venues, sports venues, but soccer in particular, have been, key sites where you have thousands into the tens of thousands of people that are able to articulate a particular message and feel a particular kind of you know, safety, strength in numbers, familiarity, confidence, empowerment, right? Because you are at a place that you know, right? You are at a place where you understand the codes, you know the sport, you're surrounded by people, you're hearing the jokes, you're hearing the, even the insults, you're hearing everything, but it's all in this kind of familiar context. And I think that these become spaces also to express, the as we've seen LAFC in particular, but like as you mentioned, across the country, and the Latino soccer groups have played a key role in, I would say, leading the more demonstrative protests at the stadium. But if we use Nashville as an example, um, the other supported groups, right? All of these teams have many supporting groups, many, I don't know, sometimes anywhere between 5 and 10, I guess, depending on the team, maybe even more, right? So the Brigada de Oro in Nashville is one of, again, I don't know how many, but I know it's between 5 and 10. But it was really impressive and noteworthy to see the entire span of groups, in solidarity and acknowledging. I mean, it brings other people that might not live it in the day to day in the same way, right? It brings
Mm.
them in, like, where's the rest of the supporter groups? And anybody coming to the stadium realizes immediately that there are massive voids. But it is a good point to highlight in terms of thinking about Latino politics and sports and protests and the long traditions at stadiums, at World Cups. And so it is something to kind of keep an eye on in terms of there have been I've seen images on socials of Abolish ICE pop up at a couple of the Club World Cup games. But as we know, I mean, this is that's where socials become an important way to convey this message and these expressions, because the TVs certainly aren't um, picking up on that, or showing that, and the commentators are also largely silent.
Yeah, what have we in terms of a silence or voice? You mentioned Angel City quickly creating t-shirts that demonstrate that the franchise, was connected to the community, valued the immigrant population of Los Angeles and the fans. You've of course seen teams in years past attempt to cultivate relationship, at least if nothing else, to sell tickets. But now seems to be a critical test of, is it purely just about marketing, or is it about more than that? Like, have we seen team owners or coaches or like just the organizations themselves say anything? Is that silence going to be a problem with these fans in the future if silence remains?
Yeah, no, that's another, important and long-term question. I think, speaking as a fan, I think it's an ongoing long-term view of the situation. I think as decisions have been made at local fan group levels about how to participate, when to participate, I think everybody is mindful of the fact that, like, these ownership groups, I mean, I don't know if there's too strong of a parallel to draw with the BLM moment and NFL owners, for example, and that resistance and tension that overlay that moment. And the published reports, again, speaking more locally, we know that there are parts of the ownership group that are, part of this administration, that have signed on to these measures in the most
Right.
explicit way, right? So I think
Elected
that,
officials.
but I don't.
Yeah.
It's just I do think, to the question before, though. I mean, I do think that being at the games, um, and voicing the discontent and the protest there, um, is the more kind of likely scenario. Right? I mean, I don't, I'm having a hard time seeing a boycott, I guess is what I'm saying,
Okay.
of this. But certainly, notice has been taken, and as we know, these things kind of. keep evolving, right? I mean, the LA Dodgers, as you know, is an institution in the city, is an
Hmm.
institution in the city of Los Angeles, and looms large in the Latino imaginary in LA. And the response there couldn't have been a greater contrast to LA, to Angel City. Um,
Hmm.
and the controversies that have arisen there and the published reports and so like I think that um, it does it makes people kind of pay attention and I think more of the positive steps that have been taken at the business level have the best chance of bringing in of broadening the clientele. um, yeah.
Yeah. So for those who aren't following that story, so with the Dodgers, I know Kike Hernandez is one of the rare athletes that I've seen that has spoken out on this issue. I believe Fernando Valenzuela's daughter, and Fernando is such a key figure in Dodger history. But then you had an anthem singer that sang the anthem in Spanish, and reports are she's been banned from Dodger Stadium. Or what's the story out there in LA
I
from
mean,
the baseball?
that's it. I mean, that you just recounted it. You know, that's it. I mean, it's one of these things that, in the context of everything happening, it's a hard kind of pill to swallow because one does assume that the Dodgers would have and could have, I mean, should have, right? Taken a firmer stance, and as we know, I mean, it's never one or the other, all or nothing, and we still see all the clips of the games and the fans and people are still going. But I do think that this kind of does, again, the positive example here of what Angel City does is what I and a lot of other people are kind of more hopeful about. And that's an interesting story to kind of continue to pay attention to.
Hmm.
And again, drawing some of the BLM parallels. I mean, we both work at Vanderbilt, and we remember it was the women's basketball team, the one that faced the fans and faced, right? I mean, they're the ones
Right.
that took the stand in the most explicit and courageous way.
Yeah,
And so, like,
absolutely.
that's another question to kind of like,
It's
reflect
always been
over.
women's sports that are
Right,
willing
right,
to push at things a little
right.
bit more, at least in recent memory here.
Yeah,
So you had a Facebook post that you had been looking forward to going to Philadelphia for this tournament for a long time. You've had tickets for a long time, and that, based on what you were reading, I don't know if you're having mixed feelings about going, but mixed feelings about the whole tournament, and even hoping maybe that it failed. And I was curious about just that frame of mind that you have now, not necessarily as a professor, but just as a fan, from an immigrant family, taking your boys up there. Like, what's on your mind, and what lessons are you, even just as a dad, like
yeah.
hoping to impart to your kids at this moment in time?
Yeah, no, and I think, and I think as you put it in that earlier question about the stadium and the sport, right, and the culture, and as a way of, um, sport, soccer in particular, was very formative in shaping my identity and, in family relationships and community relationships and a Latino identity specifically in the US. And I think that that is one way in which I am trying to, and, my kids, all three of my kids enjoy sports but I do make an extra effort, when we go to the NSC games, we're with the Brigada, when we go and I make an extra effort to make sure that they're surrounded by and have a chance to kind of learn about and experience Latino soccer culture. And so, when word broke of the Club World Cup coming, I couldn't have been more ecstatic about this opportunity, 6, 8 months ago, and just looking forward to the tickets. And our family had spent some time in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, recently, and we watched some games there of Flamengo, which is the most popular and recently the most successful soccer team in Brazil. And we just really took it in. And so when they were announced to be playing in Philadelphia, they're playing Chelsea, said, okay, well, we're gonna go experience this because I want you to know what to relive this again, and then just kind of string together these overarching experiences. And so those decisions and plans were made, months ago, right? And I think that as we have gotten closer, There was this immense guilt and resentment and anger that built up over the last, really once we saw what happened in Nashville, in early May, it's just really soured the whole idea of being able to take in a moment like that, knowing people are, their lives are shattered and destroyed, and we know people. I mean, this is a thing. Like, this isn't abstract, right? We know people, and so yeah, it was like last week. Part of me was like, I hope this thing tanks and it's a colossal failure, especially when the administration keeps making more and more steps to like emphasize, to like double and tripling down on this stance, and then doing it through the competition and the booted and suited, post, and knowing the support that still holds, nationally, and seeing polls of that support this, but also as the competition started, as we watched the first game together a few nights ago, and we kind of get excited. I mean, I think it's through the soccer experience, there is a larger cultural exposure and excitement that brings. But at the same time, if there are signs that they need to see at the stadium that are, critical of the situation, I'll absolutely be sure to point them out. And it's happy and satisfying to see them reckoning with and developing a certain awareness about this as well, too.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's, yeah, I mean, it's just kind of the all or nothing. It's not impossible. I think we're both, we're both kind of mindful citizens and parents, and at the same time, we know that sport is sport. It's that mix of everything, right? And so
Right.
we're just trying to like find our way through and try to, without forgetting, of course, right? I mean, and so that's one of the hopes that I have, is to have a wonderful kind of sporting experience and that moment together, and at the same time, um, you know, yeah,
Yeah.
and seeing. I mean, we're hearing now that there's a possibility of escalating some of these raids in predominantly Democratic cities, and Philadelphia
Hmm.
was one of the ones that was mentioned, and so the competition is still going to be there for the next 2 weeks. I mean, it's important to kind of not let go of that, because it'll sadly be with us after this tournament ends in early July.
So obviously there's nothing new under the sun, right? So you must see some parallels to 94, a World Cup that you've, studied in your professional capacity, but that you attended as a young man. What are the parallels that you see between what is happening in the country regarding immigration and the debates that were had in California at that point, and how the world of soccer or the world of sports is intersecting or intersected with that back then in 94?
No, yeah, I mean, you know, couldn't have wished to have been writing in a different context about that summer of 94, and how, what a watershed moment that was in US and global soccer history. The success of the overall, like, financial success of the World Cup, and how that success, the record-breaking profits that were had, and the attendance marks that still stand from 30 years ago, and how that narrative has dominated the way that foundational moment in modern U.S. soccer has been held. And I was motivated to return to that and to think more critically about also another moment that has been equally as impactful long term, and then immediately then, in terms of socially, which was a Proposition 187 anti-immigrant campaign that launched in California, and that, one-handedly won with 59% backing statewide. One in LA, that was at the time 40% Latino, and it had over 55% support in LA, including with smaller segments of the Latino community. So but it was nonetheless a very kind of complicated and loaded moment. And this is, and as you were mentioning earlier about the stadium protests, I mean, one excellent example of this happening that has been sort of silenced in the historical record is when they had the inaugural game in LA. LA was one of the nine-hole cities. And so governor at the time, Pete Wilson, went to go give, ironically enough, a welcome speech as he was spearheading what at the time had been the worst of the anti-immigrant campaigns. And at a game between Colombia and Romania, where journalists that were covering, put the crowd at 60 to 70% Latino. And he was jeered, he was drowned out his entire speech. And interestingly, that aspect hasn't been covered, right? I mean, that is a direct form of protest, of standing up and of expression that isn't part of that World Cup and that World Cup narrative. And there were other incidents more at the local level of celebrations that turned into clashes and were described as riots in Latino neighborhoods in LA. And when you start reading comparatively about how, the Greek communities in Boston might be celebrated for supporting their teams, or the Irish that were down in Orlando for that team, or the Brazilians that were up in the San Jose area, right? That's all colorful and festive. But when it's the quote Mexicans, right? Like that was a different charge that it brought out. It brought out a different response. If there is some kind of tumult at a surfing competition in Huntington Beach, you don't get the SWAT team, you don't get the helicopters flying overhead, you don't get the waves and waves of journalistic coverage about what is wrong with, particular communities. And these are things that, like, to me, are important to kind of return to and rethink as part of this kind of sporting legacy of 94. And so certainly the parallels, at least in terms of the themes of immigration and how hard it's hitting, and knowing how important that is to the Latino community, right? Like it's not that the Olympics aren't, but like the World Cup, soccer in particular, it just hits in very kind of foundational way. And so, like, I think that, like, it motivated me to get going on this book. And I just wish I had taken the initiative earlier than I did. And I would have been, ready to publish it, now ahead of 26, but nonetheless, it'll come out around the 28 Olympics. And I think it's, hopefully continue to be relevant given the 2031 Women's World Cup that's coming, to the US and Mexico now. So, um, it's what at the time felt like the harshest and the worst and the unimaginable and unbearable. Sadly and tragically now you know, that got held up in the courts by and large. I mean, it was ugly, it was disgusting, it was race, but what we are seeing now, I mean, we're hard pressed to think of having seen this in our
Hmm.
lifetimes, right? And so yeah, this is yeah, this
Yeah.
hopefully, helps us think more critically about, the sort of sports and immigration question, and that's what I'm excited about in terms of this book.
Yeah. Before I let you go, just I've always had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder ever since I was a student here many years ago about just sports being taken seriously in the academy, that it is a worthy area of scholarship. I mean, I think there's no doubt about it, and just listening to you and these connections between sports and immigration and protest and Latino culture in the United States and around the world. Like, what's been your experience with that? And do you see people's eyes who maybe were skeptical of sports as a legit area of study, is it so obvious now that like those skeptics are fewer and far between, or how much do you deal with that? I know you teach a soccer related course here. We now have a sports and society minor at Vanderbilt, so seems like things are changing. But like, how much do you still see resistance to it, and what ways have you tried to overcome that?
Yeah, no, those are all big questions, and you're right. I mean, I do think that where we're at now in terms of just the curriculum and in terms of the positioning of the Sports and Society Initiative, the support that is now had for at least 5, 7 years that I'm remembering, maybe longer. That in of itself are suggests that, like, as an institution there is an interest in continuing to foster these kinds of conversations and teaching and research. Um, In my own case, I'm guilty of having internalized that, that complex, if you will, in terms of sports and it being a I don't know if prestigious is the right word, but like a field of study that is worthy, right? Alongside, so in my own case, I was trained in the area of the study of the African diaspora, the history of enslavement. I've worked in that capacity in the 19th century. I've written about a book about the abolition of slavery in Brazil, and I've taken on a number of other projects dealing with literature and slavery. And it wasn't until more recently in 2021 when I had an opportunity to direct this new Center for Latin American, Caribbean, Latinx Studies, where a handful of us said, okay, we're going to teach our way into it becoming a meaningful part of the curriculum, and everybody kind of latch on to your thing and teach it. You're the best, right? And so to me, that moment where I was like, this is where I'm going to finally do my soccer class, and I think that what that's opened up and other conversations that we've had around, with other colleagues that are also teaching it and around the college and the university more generally is, now there's, compared to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there's a lot more oversight, accountability in terms of enrollments in courses. Whereas before, people might have been dismissive and attributed to the students' lack of, general interest and awareness in whatever topics. Now you can't teach. If my course on Brazil doesn't make, then I got to teach something that does make, right? And I think that like somehow from the bottom up, if you will, going through the students and building it out of undergraduate um, experiences and interest, because as you well know, there is a lot of interest, right? And kind of, I think if you build it, they're coming, and that's what's kind of happening. And I think we're all very excited about the development of this minor, and I think that as a teaching field and as a research field, it does have a different standing than it did, right? And I mean, again, the Sports and Society Initiative has been integral to kind of connecting a lot of dots because I think what makes it exciting is that like there is the sort of real world, real time athletics dimensions to it, and then there's a kind of classroom, and then there's, some of the student experiences and internship possibilities that have been created. So I think we're all excited about exploring that, and then it does take some juggling, right? About like delving into questions that take us to, challenging ethical concerns sometimes, but that it's being supported, I think is exciting. And so I'm hopeful about it and I'm excited about it in terms of our own context, right? Bigger picture, I mean, truth be told, I mean, I don't know if we need more sociological studies of the academy and in general and people that, grew up enjoying and enjoying it with their families and in terms of sports, right, as opposed to I don't
Right.
know, music or film that rings a little bit more, I don't know, sophisticated, if you will. um, so yeah, but I do absolutely, I'm excited to kind of keep building out more classes and conversations with librarians, and then they're acquiring more materials that enable us to just incorporate more materials. And we have wonderful resources at the library with the television news archive. So yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that this continues to draw more student interest and we kind of expand what we're doing.
Yeah, well, students here are so lucky to be able to take your courses. We're fortunate you're able to take some time to join the show before you head up to Philadelphia with your family for the Club World Cup. Thank you for providing this perspective on what we were seeing in the intersection of sports and politics and immigration and protest right now in so many parts of the country. I'm sure just only going to continue throughout this tournament, throughout regular season, soccer matches, and then with the Olympics and the World Cup and the Women's World Cup coming, something to keep an eye on for years to come. So I'm sure we'll come back to you, Celso.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
again.
Edward. It's been a great pleasure. I really appreciate it.